There are mysteries of placer gold that not very many prospectors understand. And by learning them, by understanding them, by knowing them, you can be more successful and you can go out and find more gold. Today we're going to talk about placer gold secrets, where gold comes from. Now most of you probably say, Chris, I don't need this video. I know where gold comes from. It comes from quartz veins. Well, of course it does, sort of, not really. Are you sure that it comes only from quartz veins? Maybe not other places too? Are you 100% sure? Well, we're going to kind of dig into that. Because if the only important source of placer gold was quartz veins, then all of what we find would look like this.
Like pieces of quartz with gold shot through it. Now some quartz might have more gold or less gold than this, but still this is the kind of thing we would be finding if this was the main source. And even when searching through rounded river gravels, we would be finding specimens of quartz and gold that look like this. Now, certainly some pieces of gold in quartz are found because, hey, that's what I'm showing you in this video. And I'm not trying to say that gold isn't found in quartz veins, because clearly it is. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But the question is, the nuggets we find, where are they coming from? But I can tell you that I've found more than 1,000 nuggets with my metal detectors over the years, probably closer to 2 or 3, and only a very, very small percentage is quartzy gold like this. Most of it has little or no attached quartz. And this just isn't my experience alone. It's not like I'm some outlier. I've talked to a lot of prospectors, and they would tell you the same thing, that most of the gold that they find, like 95%, 98%, is gold that has little or no quartz attached to it.
But the truth is, whether we're metal detecting or whatever, most of the gold, like the vast majority of the gold, looks like this.
This is a nice grouping of nuggets I found with my metal detector, and there's virtually no quartz on them at all. And they look like this. Now, not all of these are smooth. Some are smooth, but there's some of these that are still fairly rough. It came from a location in fairly high country part of California gold country. And here's a group of about 170 small nuggets that I got on a trip to Alaska. And there's literally no quartz in these at all. Now you might say, hey Chris, all those nuggets have been rolled around in a river and smoothed, and whatever quartz was once attached to them has been beaten off of them. But these gold nuggets have never been in any river. You can see they're sharp, they're angular, pointed, they're not rounded, and they don't have any quartz attached to them. Here's some gold that I dry washed a few years ago. This is glacial gold, and it's been pushed around a little bit by a glacier, but it really hasn't been rolled around or pounded up in a stream. And you can see this stuff is rough and angular and shows very little, if any, quartz. Here's a bunch of gold from a patch I found last summer. This is a residual area. This gold has never been in any stream or rolled around or had quartz broken off of it. You can see how angular it is. And yet there's only a little quartz here. You can see a little bit of the white quartz on a couple of the pieces. But most of these pieces have little or no quartz, and they're very angular, and they came out of the ground this way. And this is my point, is that a lot of gold comes out of the ground with no quartz. It never had any quartz attached to it to speak of.
Now you might say to me, hey Chris, when you're running a sluice box or panning or something like that, the gold that's mixed with quartz, because the average density of the rock is not that great. Quartz is pretty light. Gold is really heavy, but, a lot of times pieces and chunks of gold quartz, may only have, 10 or 15% of their weight in total as gold. And the other 80% or so is going to be quartz. And so, through a sluice box, you're just not going to catch that stuff. But I'm going to tell you that with a metal detector, it doesn't matter. If there's chunky gold in quartz And even if the gold is only 10 or 15% of the piece, your metal detector's gonna see that no problem. You know, I've found thousands of nuggets with my metal detectors over the years, and I've only found a handful of gold quartz specimens like that. Definitely a small minority, probably, I don't know, less than a few percent, less than 5%, probably 1 or 2% of the chunks that I've found in the ground have significant quartz attached. You know, some may have a little tiny bit of quartz, like I showed in the picture, but, it's not coming from quartz veins. Yes, gold occurs in quartz veins. Yes, absolutely. And please don't think that I'm not saying, that I'm somehow teaching quartz, it doesn't produce gold. That's not true. There is gold in quartz veins. But the other thing to consider is that the vast majority of all the gold in quartz veins that gets worked, like, a quartz vein that has enough gold in it that they put a mine on it and, sunk a shaft or put in an adit or did other workings and stoped out some ore and took it and processed it, the vast majority of the gold that's in those gold veins is tiny, tiny. It's dust. Let me show you.
The gold that came out of most hard rock mine districts in, all over the western U.S. and Australia and other places is like this. It's really the fine gold dust, little particles, maybe, 20 mesh and less. It's the fine stuff, and this isn't the kind of nuggets that we're finding with metal detectors. You can get this with the sluice if you operate your sluice right, but still, it's really fine, and it's not the kind of coarse gold that we're thinking of when we're thinking of nuggets.
So that most of the placer gold that we find is probably not coming from things that look really like quartz veins. They may have some quartz in them. I'm not saying that. And I'm not saying that gold or quartz veins don't produce gold, because they certainly do. But a lot of the placer we're getting is coming from some other source. And that's the part that's interesting and different. That's the mystery that not very many prospectors understand. So do you want to learn about that? Well, we're going to dig in and talk about those kinds of sources and different places that gold occurs, but it may not be coming out of a nearby quartz vein. It may be coming out of something that looks a lot different than a quartz vein. So let's get started by talking about placer deposits that have little or no lode deposits associated with them. So how do you have placers with little or no associated lode deposits? I mean, especially if the gold is coming from quartz veins, if there's basically no quartz veins, how can there be gold there? Well, there's a couple of different answers to that, and that's one of the big things that we're going to talk about. The first is a kind of easy one, but it's kind of rare, and it's ancient sources of gold. Basically, gold, once it weathers out of a vein or shear zone or other kind of deposit, the gold doesn't really go anywhere. Gold sitting on the side of a hill isn't going to just dissolve and go away. Even gold sitting in a river doesn't dissolve to any significant degree. So the gold, it can accumulate, where you get lots of pieces, land in the same spot, and that's what I mean by accumulating. But it doesn't go anywhere. It can literally, there's rivers that were ancient rivers that had lots of gold that got buried in volcanic rocks, and other mountains were uplifted around them. And so you have these ancient sources of gold, and as new erosion cuts into those old gravels, old stream beds, anything like that, the old gold is eroded back out and becomes in play again. It gets into new and modern streams. There are places like this. The Black Hills of South Dakota are basically, a lot, not all, but a lot of the placer gold that comes from them are from ancient placers that have been reworked, re-eroded, and re-put into new and modern streams. There's places like that in Australia. And of course, the most famous one of all is the Witwatersrand in South Africa, an ancient gravel that's been eroded and exposed. So, gold doesn't go anywhere. And of course, the tertiary channels in California, where those channels have been eroded and cut, the old gold that was in those riverbeds is washed now into new streams and modern rivers. So ancient sources of gold, because gold doesn't weather and go away, ancient sources of gold can be important in some areas for a source of gold. The next is what I really want to talk about. It's the shear and fault zones. Now, a lot of people, they don't understand this. They think, well, quartz veins deposit in fault zones, and that's very true. But sometimes you can have shear and fault zones that have little or very little or almost no quartz at all that have good gold in them. And let me show you a little diagram about that, and we'll talk more about how these things work.
I know this is kind of an advanced idea, but where you have a fault zone in an area that's mineralized and the fault takes a bend or is offset at all, you get movement in different directions that open up what's shown on this diagram as a zone of extension. And basically, extension means you're opening up openings in the rock. Basically, rock is generally pretty brittle, at least in a lot of environments. And so as you move it across this way, you get openings, you get shearing and openings, zone of extension, and you create openings that allow mineralized fluids to flow. And the width between these offset faults, this can be just an inch or two, up to a number of inches, up to a few feet, and sometimes even as much as tens of feet. But generally, inches to few feet is probably a typical zone of shearing and extension that will allow mineralized fluids to flow. And you can see it's a comparatively small area, and if you get highly mineralized fluids here, you may get a super rich pocket of gold. And this is how some pockets are formed.
Sometimes these are whole zones of faulting and breaking. A lot of people think of a fault zone as being one narrow, just a contact of two rocks and one slips past the other. Well, those can be like that. I mean, it's not saying that never happens, but a lot of times fault zones, you get a width to them too. You get a zone of broken rock, and the mineralized fluids that are coming up from below and carry the gold, those mineralized fluids can get into that cracked or broken zone and deposit little bits of quartz and little bits of gold. And part of the reason that they don't always go perfectly together is that almost all deposits, whether it be a regular quartz vein or something like these shear zones or fracture zones, fault zones, when the gold is deposited, it has an order of deposition. It's not like the fluid at the beginning, the hot fluid that's coming up, is exactly the same as the hot fluid at the end of the process. And actually, usually the end of the process is very different from the start. That's just how quartz veins form. And normally you get the first phase of the hot fluids coming up are quartz rich and gold poor, and also sulfide poor. And so you get a period of time where you get quartz vein formation, and then as that's starting to teeter off and taper off, you get more, and it's not like, oh, well, we've got a lot of quartz, and then suddenly a light switch went off, and now we're getting all sulfides. It does kind of transition from one to the other. So you get a quartz-rich, gold and sulfide poor pulse, and then over time it transitions to a more sulfide-rich pulse that has the mineralization, and a little bit more gold, and then usually the very last phase of the whole thing is the gold-rich phase. Now, it doesn't always work like this. If somebody's a geologist, you're out there and watching this and you're saying, Chris, it works that way a lot of the time, most of the time, but not all the time. It's like, yeah, I understand. It doesn't do that every single time, but it's very common. It's It's, I think, the majority of the time, at least from the districts that I've ever looked at, usually the last stage is the gold richest stage. And because of this, you see in rocks, basically the gold a lot of times is in cracks or in break points where the quartz already formed, but there's a crack here, and that's a crack that liquid can flow through, and the gold rich liquids flow through and deposit the gold in the crack.
This specimen from the 16-to-1 mine in Allegheny in California in the Sierra Mother Lode country is a great example of this. If you look closely at this piece, you can see the gold is in cracks between chunks of quartz. The quartz was there first, and then the gold-bearing solutions came into the cracks that were left in the quartz. And so that's how the gold was deposited. It's not deposited in the quartz, but in the cracks in between them.
And so you get a lot of these things where you have these fault zones, and maybe the late stage gold rich stuff comes in them, and maybe it has a pretty good iron and a little bit of quartz, and you get these shear zones that have nice gold, relatively little quartz, and pretty good iron, which a lot of times the iron is originally laid down as pyrite. Okay, and then what we find on the surface as we, are attacking something we find with our metal detector, the stuff has been at the surface for a lot of time, and it's oxidized. The pyrite has oxidized into just iron oxide rust. And so these things are really important. And I want you guys to keep this in the back of your mind, this idea of shear zones that happen without huge amounts of quartz, with no real obvious quartz vein. You can have a sheeted system of little veins, or you can have a broken zone, or you can just have, a couple of faults, a fault or two that carries this. You can find this if you're looking at a residual deposit, faults, and including these zones, whether they have width to them, some of them are maybe even up to 50 feet wide, but some of them are only a couple of feet wide. Either way, they can have gold deposited in them, and the fluids that go into them can be some of these late stage systems that come up from deep below and are rich in gold, but don't actually have that much quartz. Maybe a little bit of pyrite, maybe a good amount of pyrite, but even so, it's got the gold. And there's a whole lot of gold deposits, especially if you're looking at a residual or alluvial type of deposit. Think about, that these things can be linear in their shape. So when you're out looking for gold, if you find some here and you can figure out the line, the angle that it's on, you may get another nugget patch just over a little bit by following the line, if you understand the linear nature of these faults and shear zones. Another reason you can have a placer with little or no lode is, and this happens, remember I said the gold endures, it doesn't dissolve or weather away or disappear. It can, be buried and stuck in rocks for huge amounts of time. I mean, the stuff in Witwatersrand and in the Dakotas is, really, really ancient. And so it lasts, it doesn't go away. But you can have this in a lesser type of thing where you have basically a placer that was formed by various lodes and shears and quartz veins and stuff, but the deposits have basically eroded away. I mean, the gold is old, it's been in the same place for a long time, and the sources, they were up here originally, and the weathering and erosion has taken them down and down and down and down, and maybe only now there's some roots of the quartz veins, not much, little or nothing maybe even, and they can be so that you have these that are there because of sources that no longer are things that you could see or notice on the ground or observe. They're just weathered away. So there certainly are lode areas that do have good placer, all right? And, one of the things that I want to emphasize with that is that a lot of times the gold is coarsest nearest to the source. And this is because it takes energy to move gold in a stream or a river. It takes energy to move it downstream. And the smaller the gold particle, the less energy it takes to move it on downstream. And so the coarser gold takes a lot more energy to move it downstream. And so generally speaking, it's not like every particle of gold is going to be bigger as you get closer, but generally speaking, the coarser particles, the bigger nuggets, are going to be closer to the sources. And so if you know that a certain vein or vein system is going to be, the source of the placer gold, well, you want to be up closer to it in order to get the coarser nuggets, the bigger gold. And, the bigger gold is going to accumulate up there. And so it's important to understand that in areas where you do have good placer associated with lode deposits, well, you want to be up close to those zones where the lode deposits are found. And next, you want to understand that there's places where there's placer gold that's far away from the source. And so there is no source nearby. Generally speaking, these are going to be small gold places, places with very fine gold. And, it's because, as I just mentioned, that smaller gold takes less energy to move it on down. And that's why when you get to beaches, like beach placers, generally speaking, the beach placer gold is very fine. It's small sized. I had a guy who got some beach gold up in Washington send me a sample, and he's a good guy, and man, it was tough to recover that stuff because it's so tiny. And of course, in beach placers, you end up with a whole bunch of black sand, and that only makes the recovery of it a little more difficult. So beaches and other places where there have been like ancient rivers that have transported the gold a long way, you can get decent gold deposits that are actually quite a ways from their original source. But as long as you understand where the gold concentrates and how it got there, you're going to be better off in finding the good places where the gold has accumulated, even if it's small. I also want to talk about lode areas where you have a known lode and there seems to be good gold there, but there's little or no placer associated with them. And those exist too. You have what seems to be decent gold, and there just doesn't seem to be much accumulation. Well, there's a couple of different reasons. One of them is that the drainages, if in real steep country, you get steep drainages, it just pushes all the gold away from the source. And so, there just isn't any accumulation because it's so steep, everything just wants to run downhill. Another reason for it is that sometimes, remember I said that most hard rock sources, the gold is really small, like dust. Well, for the most part, dust, when it's super fine like that, it doesn't collect into normal types of placer deposits with pay streaks and stuff like that you expect to see. Goldfield is a great example of this. The gold at Goldfield in Nevada is so fine. I mean, you may look at it and see streaks that are rich with little particles so that it almost looks like a solid string of gold, but it's not. It's little tiny particles, and when the rock breaks down, it's little tiny particles, and they get washed away and they don't accumulate. You end up with, specks of gold distributed through a lot of gravel, and it just doesn't accumulate into a good placer, a good workable placer. The other possibility is that the veins that have been exposed, you're basically at the very top of them, that only just the tops are exposed, and there just hasn't been enough time for them to erode and accumulate a good amount of placer. And so you may have veins with reasonably coarse gold, and you may have a number of them, but you just don't have any placer because you're way at the top of the system, and they've just been exposed, and there just isn't a lot of gold that's weathered on down into the streams and creeks to accumulate. Finally, let's talk about exploring types of areas that other prospectors ignore. And one of those is basically these shear zones and not understanding them. They may find, a lot of prospectors may find a nugget or two, but they don't understand where the gold is coming from. And knowing the general linear nature, even if these fault or shear zones have a curve to them, it's still kind of going in a line, even if the line is a curved line. But usually the lines are fairly straight. And by knowing that gold occurs along these lines, you can follow it and find more gold for yourself. Another related source type of prospect that a lot of miners and prospectors ignore is hard rock mines. If the hard rock mine has coarser gold, then it can be one of those sources that can be metal detected or prospected. There's even, good mine dumps that can be dry washed, and the fine gold come out of them can be worthwhile and well worth having. So, there's a lot of different aspects of these hard rock mines that can be productive for the prospector. And remember too that whether you're looking at shear zones or rich pockets, because a lot of times these shear and fault zones can throw pockets that are super rich in gold that can have, anywhere from a few ounces to hundreds of ounces. You can follow these pockets, and if you're prospecting up a stream, you'll be coming up the stream and you'll find the gold will get on average coarser and coarser until you get to the source. When the stream crosses the source, that's what is going to be the best gold. Let me show you a couple diagrams to explain that as well.
Now in this diagram, it shows at the upper part a quartz vein, but you can imagine this as being a linear type of shear zone, fault zone type of thing with very little quartz. It would be less obvious, but you can trace the gold up, and on the left-hand side, it's richer, and it says rich shoot. So there's a rich area of the zone. And of course, the best and coarsest gold is going to come out of there. And then on the other side, on the right side, that's less rich, but still contributing gold into the streams. And so when you cross over these zones that are contributing gold into the drainage, you'll know. And once you get past it, it suddenly gets much weaker and, doesn't really contribute much to the stream. And so the stream will go from being really rich to really low grade and almost barren, just real quickly. And when you find a source where you go basically from real rich to barren pretty quick, you know that you're near the source. You know that there's a pocket or some rich area real close by, and there's whole techniques for tracing these up to their source. And I know guys who've done this and been crazy successful finding gold. So I'm going to put a link here to talk about the video, that's the videos that I have about tracing and learning to follow these leads up to the source, because they can be really rich, whether it's a quartz vein or some sort of shear zone with very little quartz that's not very obvious. These things can be traced and usually yield quite well.
So understanding the sources, the fact that most quartz veins and productive quartz veins don't produce lots of gold that you can easily process by sluicing or metal detecting or dry washing. Most of them produce real fine dust that doesn't make a good placer, but some do. And knowing the difference between the ones that produce some coarse gold and are well worth prospecting that area and ones that don't and are not worth prospecting that area, that makes you a better prospector. Understanding that the coarse gold hangs up closer to the source, and understanding that these fault zones can be followed, the linear shear zones can be followed. These will make you a better prospector and help you find more gold. Now, finding gold is a skill. I mean, there's a reason that, right now it's like $3,300 an ounce, which that's not a lot of gold, or not a lot of gold to be worth a good amount of money. It doesn't take a lot of gold to be worth, $1,000. So when gold is so valuable, it tells you it's rare. It's hard to find. It's not easy. I don't want to ever sound like going out and finding lots of gold is just easy, because it's just not true. But I wrote a book. It's called Fistful of Gold, and I'm partnered with a prospecting outfit called High Plains. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my prospecting book that gives you the skill you need to find gold, and High Plains, which is where I sell most of the books from. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them both right now. This is my book, Fistful of Gold. It's an encyclopedia of everything you need to know to go out and find gold for yourself. It distills down my 45 years of experience out in the field prospecting, as well as my degree in mine engineering. It's, like I say, an encyclopedia. There's a lot to it. It's over 250,000 words long, hundreds of pages with hundreds of illustrations, teaching you what you need to know about geology, about mining districts, about techniques of finding gold. It covers metal detectors, sluicing, panning, dry washing, high bankers, you name it, it's covered in there. It talks some about platinum and diamonds, but it's mostly about gold because gold is more widespread. It is not so much a book about where to find gold, but a book about how to find gold. Because even if you have a location where gold was mined in the past and you go out there, well, where should you look to be successful in your prospecting, to find the gold that's there? This is the book that's going to tell you that information. I spent most of 10 years writing this book, so I thought a long time about it. It's got, like I say, lots of information and lots of illustrations, and I've had results from people who bought it. It's available on Amazon, but I recommend buying it through High Plains Prospectors, and I'll put a link in the description for buying this book through them. They have a better price than Amazon, and I have a special deal that I'll tell you a little bit more about, where you can get a 5% discount from the price even with that. On Amazon, the book rates a 4.7 out of 5, which means that of all the people that have bought it, they've been really highly satisfied, and I think you, if you buy my book, will be just as highly satisfied as well. Now let's talk a little bit more about High Plains Prospectors. They're a prospecting shop, a mail order prospecting shop that I've partnered with. The deal is that I can get you a 5% discount, a coupon code, and I'm going to put the code to that right here. It's just Chris Ralph, all caps with no space between Chris and Ralph. You put that in there as a discount code and you'll get 5% off their already really good prices. I think it's a great deal where you win by getting a discount, I get a little percentage of that, and they get new business. So if you need prospecting supplies, High Plains is really the way to go. And I'll put information, like I say, in the description more about how you can work with them, because I'm working with them. They really are great guys, a great company. For even more information, I also have a website, and I'm going to show you my webpage and talk a little bit more about that right now.
This is my webpage. It's located at NevadaOutbackGems.com. You can Google it, or I have a link down in the description below. But there's lots of information here, miscellaneous stuff, pictures, some historic information as well, stories. It's got a lot of great fun stuff. You'll probably be interested in it.
Now, on all of my YouTube videos, I encourage you guys to ask questions. If you have thoughts, comments, suggestions for things that I ought to look at in my videos, things that you want to find out more about, and I answer 100% of my questions. There's not very many YouTubers out there that answer 100% of their questions. I'm one of the few. And so I will do my best to answer what you have. I mean, I only can write so much. Sometimes the answer is something where I'm going to recommend that you buy the book and read about it. I also ask that you subscribe to my channel, click the bell notification so that every time I come out with a new video, you'll be able to watch it. And like I say, I cover a huge amount of topics. I also have 250 videos that I've already done. And so you can go back through my catalog of videos on YouTube. I'm sure there'll be many videos there that you'll want to take a look at, especially if you have any interest in gold or platinum, diamonds, gemstones, geology, and that sort of stuff. My YouTube site is going to be right up your alley. So I'll see you again real soon. We'll be out in the field and I'm back in the office at the whiteboard, and whether we're looking at gold or platinum, diamonds, gemstones, or other interesting geology, it's going to be fun. You're going to enjoy it, and we'll see you again real soon.